What happens when a laid-back Hollywood favorite walks onto one of the most opinionated tables on television, and the conversation suddenly stops being polite? Make sure to subscribe to the Star Talks and like and comment for more talk show coverage. The studio lights are bright, the audience is already buzzing, and the hosts of The View are settling into their seats. The cameras glide across the table while the crowd applauds. Whoopi Goldberg leans back slightly in her chair, glancing down at her cue cards. "All right," she says with that familiar calm tone. "We've got a guest today who people have loved for, 3 decades now." The audience cheers immediately. "Yeah," one of the co-hosts laughs. "That's when you know you're doing something right." Whoopi smirks. He's starring in a new project everybody's talking about, and apparently he's still somehow aging backwards. The crowd laughs. "Please welcome Paul Rudd." The audience erupts in applause as Paul Rudd walks onto the stage, waving and smiling in that relaxed, slightly bashful way he's known for. He shakes hands with the hosts and takes his seat at the table. "Wow," Paul says, glancing at the audience. "This is a very enthusiastic crowd." "Don't get used to it," Whoopi replies dryly. The audience laughs again. Paul chuckles. "Fair enough." One of the co-hosts leans forward. "Paul, first of all, we have to ask the question that everyone always asks you. What is the secret?" Paul raises an eyebrow. "To what?" "To not aging," she says. The audience claps and cheers again. Paul laughs and shrugs. "Good lighting." Whoopi tilts her head. "You're telling me it's just lighting?" "Well, lighting, denial, and a lot of moisturizers," Paul jokes. The crowd laughs. Another host jumps in. "But seriously, you've been in so many iconic movies, and now you're doing this new project. Tell us about it." Paul nods. "Yeah, it's been exciting. It's a little different from what people expect from me. There's more drama in it." Whoopi glances at the card again. "And," she says slowly, "there's also some political themes in it." Paul nods again. "Yeah, there are." One of the co-hosts smiles. "So let's talk about that." Paul shifts slightly in his chair. "Sure." She continues, "Your character talks a lot about division in the country, media influence, things like that." "Yeah," Paul says carefully. "It's really about people learning to listen to each other again." The audience murmurs approvingly. Whoopi leans forward slightly. "Well, that sounds nice," she says. Paul nods. "But," Whoopi continues, "a lot of people feel like celebrities talking about politics is, well." She pauses and looks up at him. "Not always helpful." The audience reacts with a mix of laughter and murmurs. Paul smiles politely. "Okay." One of the co-hosts quickly jumps in. "Oh boy, we're starting early today." The crowd laughs. Whoopi continues calmly. "I'm serious, though. You've got actors, musicians, everybody telling people how they should think." Paul nods slowly. "I understand that criticism." "So why do it?" Whoopi asks. There's a brief pause. Paul rests his hands on the table. "Well, I think everyone has opinions, and actors are also citizens." A few audience members clap. Whoopi shrugs slightly. "Sure, but millions of people listen to you." Paul responds calmly. "That doesn't mean they should automatically agree with me." One of the co-hosts nods. "That's fair." But Whoopi isn't quite letting it go. "Except," she says, "when someone famous says something, it becomes a headline." Paul tilts his head. "That's usually not our decision." The audience laughs. "True," Whoopi admits. Another host jumps in. "But Paul, the movie also touches on media trust, right?" "Yeah," Paul says. "There's a storyline about how people get information. And misinformation," she adds. "Exactly." Whoopi folds her hands on the table. "See, now that's interesting to me." Paul nods. "Because we live in a time where people don't trust anything anymore." The audience murmurs again. Whoopi gestures around the set. "Not the media, not the government, not even doctors sometimes." Paul listens quietly. "And," she adds, "movies sometimes make that worse." Paul raises his eyebrows slightly. "How so?" "Well," Whoopi says, "stories can push certain narratives." Paul pauses before answering. "Stories can also make people think." A small ripple of applause comes from the audience. Whoopi looks at him carefully. "That depends on the story." One of the co-hosts laughs nervously. "Okay, we're getting deep this morning." Paul smiles lightly. "I didn't expect a philosophy class at 9 a.m. The audience laughs again. Whoopi chuckles too, but she leans in again. "I'm just saying, sometimes Hollywood acts like it understands regular people." Paul nods. "That's a fair concern." "Is it?" Whoopi asks. "Sure, Paul replies. But I also think art reflects the people making it. One host jumps in, and audiences decide what they like. Exactly, Paul says. Whoopi tilts her head again. But you see, the problem is influence. Paul keeps his tone relaxed. Influence exists everywhere, though. In politics, Whoopi says. In media. In entertainment. Paul nods. Yes. And social media, another host adds. The audience laughs knowingly. Paul chuckles. Especially social media. Whoopi taps the table lightly. So here's my question. Paul looks at her. Do you think celebrities sometimes overestimate their understanding of everyday life? The audience lets out a collective, oh. One host mutters under her breath. Here we go. Paul pauses. He doesn't look angry, just thoughtful. That's an interesting question. Whoopi waits. Paul continues calmly. I think anyone can lose perspective if they stay in one bubble too long. The audience claps lightly. Whoopi nods. Okay, but, Paul adds, that's not just celebrities. Now the audience claps louder. One host laughs. He's got a point. Paul continues, still relaxed. Politicians can do that. Media can do that. Everybody can. Whoopi's expression tightens slightly, though she's still smiling. So you're saying we're all in bubbles? Paul shrugs. Sometimes, yeah. One co-host laughs. That's a fair observation. But Whoopi leans forward again. Except some bubbles are louder than others. The audience quiets down a little. Paul notices the shift in tone. I guess that depends on who's listening. Whoopi looks at him for a moment, and the table goes quiet. One of the hosts tries to lighten the mood. So Paul, before we turn this into a full political debate, but Whoopi lifts her hand slightly. No, I'm curious. The audience murmurs again. She turns back to Paul. You said something interesting. Paul nods politely. You said everyone lives in bubbles. Yes. So let me ask you something, Whoopi says. Sure. Her voice is still calm, but sharper now. Do you think Hollywood understands the people sitting in this audience? The camera briefly pans to the crowd. Paul glances toward them, then back at the table. I think some people in Hollywood do. Whoopi tilts her head again. And some don't. Paul nods. Just like any industry. The audience applauds softly. But Whoopi isn't done. She folds her arms slightly. Because sometimes, she says slowly, it sounds like celebrities are lecturing people. A few audience members clap. Others stay quiet. Paul takes a breath before answering. Well, I don't think conversations should feel like lectures. Whoopi raises an eyebrow. And yet here we are. The audience reacts with a mix of laughter and surprised murmurs. One host leans back and whispers, This just got interesting. Paul smiles politely, but now the tension at the table is unmistakable. And the discussion is only just beginning. The table goes quiet for a moment after that last line. A few audience members laugh nervously, while others clap lightly. The cameras catch Paul Rudd still smiling, but it's the kind of smile people use when they're deciding carefully what to say next. Whoopi Goldberg leans back slightly in her chair, watching him. Paul exhales softly and taps his fingers lightly on the table. Well, he says calmly, I didn't realize I was lecturing. The audience chuckles. One of the co-hosts quickly jumps in. Okay, let's not scare the guest away before the second commercial break. That gets a bigger laugh from the audience. Paul grins. I promise I'm not going anywhere. Whoopi nods once. Good, because I'm not trying to scare you. I didn't think you were, Paul replies. Another host leans forward, smiling. You know what's funny, though? This is exactly why people watch The View. Nobody agrees all the time. The audience claps. Whoopi shrugs slightly. That's the point. Paul nods. And honestly, that's healthy. Sometimes, Whoopi says. Paul laughs. Okay, most of the time. The tension lightens a little, but the conversation doesn't move away from the topic. One of the hosts looks at Paul. You said earlier that people can live in bubbles. I actually think that's true. Another co-host nods. Social media made it worse. Paul raises his eyebrows. Oh, absolutely. The audience murmurs in agreement. Whoopi folds her hands again. But here's where I push back. Paul gestures politely. Go ahead. She continues. When you're someone like you, big movies, huge audience, when you say something, people listen. Paul nods slowly. That's true. And with that, Whoopi says, comes responsibility. Paul tilts his head slightly. I agree. But do celebrities actually take that responsibility seriously? She asks. There's a small ripple in the audience. Paul pauses before answering. I think some do. And some don't, Whoopi says. Probably, Paul admits. One host chuckles. That's the safest answer I've ever heard. The audience laughs. Paul smiles. I'm trying not to get banned from the show. Whoopi laughs too, shaking her head. Oh, we don't ban people. We just argue with them. That sounds worse, Paul jokes. The audience bursts into laughter again. But Whoopi leans forward again, clearly still interested in the topic. Let me ask you something honestly. Paul nods. Okay, you said actors are citizens, right? Yeah, and citizens have opinions. Of course. Whoopi points slightly with her pen. But do you think fans always want to hear those opinions? The audience murmurs again. Paul considers the question carefully. That's a good point. One host nods. It really is. Paul continues. I think sometimes people just want entertainment. The audience claps lightly. But sometimes, Paul adds, art also reflects real life. Whoopi watches him closely. And real life is messy. Very messy, one host mutters. The crowd laughs. Paul continues calmly. So when movies touch on real issues, it's not necessarily preaching. It's storytelling. Whoopi tilts her head. Depends on how it's done. That's true, Paul says. Another co-host jumps in. But the thing is, Paul, some people feel like Hollywood leans one way politically. A few audience members clap loudly. Others stay quiet. Paul nods again. I've heard that criticism for years. And, the host asks. Paul shrugs slightly. Well, Hollywood is made up of thousands of people. True, she says. They're not all the same. Whoopi raises an eyebrow. But the loudest voices usually sound the same. The audience reacts again, a mix of applause and murmurs. Paul leans back slightly, still relaxed. That might be because the media highlights certain voices more than others. One of the hosts laughs. Oh wow, now we're blaming the media on a media show. The crowd laughs loudly. Whoopi smiles. Careful. Paul chuckles. I'm just saying, headlines tend to focus on the most dramatic opinions. Which we never do, one host jokes. The audience laughs again. Whoopi glances at the audience. Let's be honest, she says. Drama sells. Clearly, Paul replies. Another host turns toward him. But Paul, have you ever felt pressure to speak out about something politically? Paul pauses. Yeah, he admits. The audience quiets a little. Sometimes people expect celebrities to say something about every issue. Exactly, the host says. And if you don't say anything, Paul continues, people assume you don't care. Whoopi nods slowly. That's true. Paul continues. But speaking without really understanding an issue can be just as bad. The audience applauds. One host says quietly, that's actually a really fair point. Paul shrugs. I try to listen more than I talk. Whoopi looks at him for a moment. Not a bad strategy. Paul smiles. Especially on this show. The audience laughs again. But Whoopi isn't done challenging him. All right, she says. Let's take it one step further. Paul nods. You've been in Hollywood for decades. Yeah, you've seen how the industry works. Sure. She leans slightly closer. So answer this honestly. Paul sits up a little. Do you think Hollywood sometimes dismisses people who disagree with them? The audience reacts immediately, a loud mix of clapping and murmuring. One co-host quietly says, that's a loaded one. Paul smiles slightly. It is. Whoopi waits. Paul takes a breath. I think sometimes people everywhere dismiss views they don't agree with. Whoopi watches him closely. That sounds like a politician's answer. The audience laughs. Paul laughs too. Maybe I missed my calling. Another host jokes, please don't run for office. The crowd laughs again. Paul shakes his head. No, no, no. That sounds terrifying. Whoopi smiles, but she keeps pressing. But seriously, have you ever seen someone in Hollywood get shut down for having a different opinion? Paul pauses longer this time. The audience senses it. Well, he leans forward slightly. I think every industry has moments where people feel afraid to say the wrong thing. A few audience members clap. Whoopi nods slowly. So you're saying yes. Paul smiles lightly. I'm saying it's complicated. The audience laughs again. One host shakes her head. Paul Rudd came prepared today. Paul grins. I didn't know this was a debate tournament. Whoopi chuckles. Welcome to the table. The audience applauds loudly. But then Whoopi says something that shifts the mood again. You know what's interesting, though? Paul looks at her. What? She gestures toward the audience. People out there feel like they can't say certain things anymore. The room gets quieter. One host murmurs, that conversation again. Whoopi continues. They feel like if they disagree with the popular opinion online, they get attacked. Paul nods slowly. I've seen that happen. So what do you think about that? Whoopi asks. Paul folds his hands together. I think conversations are getting harder. The audience listens carefully. People assume the worst about each other. Whoopi nods slightly. And social media amplifies that. Exactly, Paul says. Another host says, but social media also gives people a voice. That's true, Paul agrees. Whoopi leans forward again. But it also creates mobs. The audience murmurs. Paul chooses his words carefully. Yeah, sometimes it does. Then Whoopi asks the question that really changes the energy at the table. Have you ever been afraid to say something publicly because of backlash? The audience goes quiet. Paul hesitates. For the first time, he doesn't answer immediately. One host notices. Oh, that's a real pause. The audience laughs nervously. Paul rubs his hands together. Honestly, Whoopi nods. Honestly. Paul looks around the table. Then back at Whoopi. Yeah, there have been times. The audience reacts immediately with a mix of gasps and murmurs. One co-host raises her eyebrows. Really? Paul nods. Yeah. Whoopi tilts her head. So, even someone like you feels that pressure. Paul smiles slightly. I think a lot of people do. The audience applauds softly. But Whoopi watches him carefully before asking one more question. And what kinds of things make you hesitate? The table goes quiet again. Paul takes a breath. And the tension at the table rises once more as he begins to answer. Paul takes a slow breath before answering the question. The audience is noticeably quieter now, and even the hosts seem curious about what he's going to say next. Well, Paul Rudd begins carefully. Sometimes it's not about the opinion itself, it's about how quickly things can spiral. A few audience members nod. One sentence, he continues, can suddenly become a headline, then a debate, then a full argument online. One of the co-hosts chuckles softly. That part is definitely true. The audience laughs. Whoopi Goldberg leans forward again, resting her elbows lightly on the table. So the fear is the reaction, she says. Sometimes, Paul replies. Not the opinion itself? Paul shrugs slightly. I think a lot of people worry more about being misunderstood. One host nods. That happens a lot now. Paul continues. You say something in a conversation like this, and suddenly a clip online cuts out half the context. The audience murmurs. Another host laughs and points toward the cameras. Don't give them ideas. Paul smiles. Too late. The crowd laughs. Whoopi watches him closely. But that's part of public life, though, she says. Paul nods. It is. So, she continues, should that stop people from speaking honestly? Paul shakes his head. No, I don't think so. A few people clap. But Paul adds, it does make people cautious. Whoopi tilts her head. Cautious or quiet? That line gets a louder reaction from the audience. One host whispers dramatically, oh. Paul chuckles a little before answering. I think sometimes cautious. Whoopi keeps her gaze on him. Because a lot of people say the culture right now punishes disagreement. The audience murmurs again. Paul takes a moment before responding. I think the internet punishes everything. That line gets a big laugh and applause. One co-host claps. That might be the most accurate thing said today. Paul laughs. It's true, though. Whoopi smiles slightly but presses forward. But there are people who feel like they can't express certain views without losing their jobs. The audience quiets again. Paul nods slowly. I've heard those stories. One of the hosts leans forward. But there's also accountability. Absolutely, Paul agrees. If someone says something harmful, people should respond. Whoopi raises a finger slightly. But who decides what's harmful? The audience reacts again. Paul pauses. That's a tough one. Another host jumps in quickly. It always is. Paul continues calmly. I think context matters. Intent matters. Whoopi nods once. And impact, she adds. Yes, Paul agrees. Impact matters too. The audience applauds lightly. But the tone at the table is still serious. One host looks at Paul and smiles. You know, people think of you as the nice guy in Hollywood. Paul laughs. I hope that's a good thing. It is, she says. But nice guys sometimes avoid conflict. Paul grins. Well, this morning proves that's not always possible. The audience laughs loudly. Whoopi chuckles too. Listen, I'm not attacking you. I didn't feel attacked, Paul says calmly. That's good, Whoopi replies. Another host jokes. We're just having breakfast with tension. The crowd laughs again. But then Whoopi shifts slightly in her chair and asks something more direct. Let me ask you something personal. Paul nods. Okay, you've worked with a lot of people in Hollywood, she says. Yeah. Do conversations like this happen privately in the industry? Paul tilts his head. What do you mean? Debates, Whoopi clarifies. Real disagreements. Paul smiles faintly. Oh yeah, all the time. The audience murmurs. One host says, see, that's interesting. Paul continues. Actors argue about politics, culture, movies, everything. Just like this table, another host says. Exactly, Paul replies. Whoopi nods slowly. But those arguments stay private most of the time. Paul shrugs. Usually. And when they don't, Whoopi says, it becomes a scandal. The audience laughs knowingly. Paul nods. That part is true. One co-host asks, do you think that's why people assume Hollywood is all the same politically? Paul considers it. Maybe. The host continues. Because we only hear one type of voice. Paul nods again. That could be part of it. Whoopi taps the table lightly. But let's be real for a second. Paul looks at her. You're in an industry that leans pretty heavily in one direction politically. The audience reacts again. Paul doesn't look surprised. I've heard that argument a lot. And, Whoopi presses. Paul leans forward slightly. I think creative industries often attract people with certain perspectives. One host nods. That's true in journalism too. Exactly, Paul says. But that doesn't mean every individual thinks the same way. The audience applauds lightly. Whoopi folds her hands. But when someone inside that industry disagrees publicly, she pauses. The reaction can be brutal. Paul nods slowly. I've seen that happen. One host glances at him. Have you ever seen someone lose opportunities because of their views? The audience quiets again. Paul hesitates before answering. I've seen people feel like they were being judged. That careful wording gets a few chuckles. One co-host laughs. You're choosing your words very carefully. Paul grins. Years of press tours. The audience laughs again. But Whoopi notices the careful phrasing. So you're saying yes, without saying yes. Paul laughs. I'm saying industries have politics just like everything else. The audience applauds. One host says quietly, that's true everywhere. Whoopi nods slowly, though she looks thoughtful. All right, she says. Then she gestures toward him. But here's something I'm curious about. Paul listens. You seem like someone who tries to stay out of the loudest fights. Paul nods. Generally. Why? Paul shrugs slightly. I don't think every opinion needs to be broadcast. The audience claps loudly at that. One host says, I like that answer. Paul continues. I also think listening is underrated. Whoopi smiles slightly. That's something we try to do here too. One of the hosts laughs. Sometimes. The audience laughs again. But Whoopi suddenly shifts the conversation in a way that catches Paul off guard. You know what's funny, though? Paul raises an eyebrow. What? You came here to talk about your movie. The audience laughs loudly. Paul laughs too. That's true. And instead, Whoopi continues, we're having a full cultural debate. Paul grins. I should bring this up with my publicist. One host jokes. They're sweating backstage right now. The crowd laughs again. But then Whoopi says something that brings the tension back. You know, a lot of people watching at home probably think Hollywood celebrities don't get challenged enough. Paul nods slowly. Maybe. So let me ask you something directly, Whoopi says. Paul sits up slightly. All right. She looks straight at him. Do you think people in entertainment sometimes talk down to the public? The audience reacts with a loud mix of clapping and murmurs. One host whispers dramatically, that's the big one. Paul pauses again. The room feels a little heavier. He looks at the audience for a moment, then back at the table. I think sometimes people can come across that way. The audience murmurs. Whoopi nods slowly. Come across that way, or actually do it. Paul smiles faintly. I'm trying to be diplomatic. The audience laughs again. Whoopi smiles too. But diplomacy doesn't always answer the question. Paul chuckles softly. That's fair. The room goes quiet again as he thinks about how to respond. Finally, Paul leans forward slightly and says something that immediately grabs everyone's attention. Let me flip that question around for a second. Whoopi raises her eyebrows. Oh, Paul nods. Yeah. He gestures lightly toward the table. Do you think the media ever talks down to the public too? The audience erupts into a mix of applause, gasps, and surprised laughter. One host immediately leans back in her chair. Oh wow. Another host covers her mouth, laughing. Now that's a turn. All eyes move toward Whoopi. And suddenly the spotlight is back on the hosts of The View. The moment Paul Rudd finishes that sentence, the entire studio reacts at once. Some people in the audience clap loudly. Others gasp. A few laugh in surprise. At the table, one of the co-hosts leans back in her chair and shakes her head with a grin. Oh wow, he flipped it. Another host laughs nervously. That's a bold move on The View. All eyes turn toward Whoopi Goldberg. For a second, she doesn't say anything. She simply looks at Paul, then glances at the audience. Then she lets out a short laugh. Well, that's a fair question. The audience applauds. Paul smiles politely, holding up his hand slightly. I didn't mean that as an attack. Whoopi waves a hand. I didn't take it as one. One of the co-hosts jumps in quickly, still smiling. But that is interesting, though. Another host nods. Yeah, because people say that about media all the time. Whoopi leans back in her chair. All right, she says. Let's talk about it. The audience cheers. Paul laughs softly. I feel like I accidentally started a panel discussion. You did, one host says, laughing. Whoopi gestures toward him. You asked if the media talks down to the public. Paul nods. Sometimes. And you're right, Whoopi says. That answer gets a noticeable reaction from the audience. She continues. There are moments where media outlets assume they know what people think. Paul listens quietly. And sometimes, Whoopi adds, they're wrong. The audience claps loudly. One of the hosts nods. That's honest. Whoopi shrugs. It's reality. Paul leans forward slightly. I think that's true in a lot of industries. Another host jumps in. Politicians do it. Corporations do it, someone else adds. And celebrities, Whoopi says, pointing at Paul with a small smile. Paul laughs. Fair enough. The audience laughs along. The tension at the table begins to shift slightly now. What started as a tense exchange has turned into a much more open discussion. One co-host turns to Paul. You know, I actually appreciate that you didn't dodge that question earlier. Which one? Paul asks. The one about being afraid to speak publicly. Paul nods. Oh yeah, that's something a lot of people relate to, she says. The audience claps again. Paul shrugs slightly. I think everyone worries about being misunderstood. Whoopi nods. That's true. Another host turns toward the audience. You know what's funny? I bet half the people watching right now are arguing about this on social media. The crowd laughs loudly. Paul chuckles. Probably already. Whoopi smirks. Oh, they definitely are. One host jokingly looks at a camera. Hello, Twitter. The audience laughs again. Paul shakes his head with a smile. This is why people love live TV. Whoopi nods. Because you can't script moments like this. Another host laughs. Your publicist definitely didn't script this. Paul grins. No, they definitely didn't. The conversation starts to loosen up again as the hosts move slightly away from the most intense part of the debate. One of the co-hosts leans forward. All right, before this turns into a full political roundtable, can we talk about your movie for at least 1 minute? The audience laughs and claps. Paul nods quickly. Yes, please. Whoopi smiles. Okay, fair enough. She glances down at her notes. So tell people what the movie is actually about. Paul finally gets the chance to explain. Well, it's about a group of people who disagree about almost everything, but they're forced to work together. The audience laughs immediately. One host points at the table. So this show. The crowd erupts with laughter. Paul laughs too. Honestly, yeah, a little like this show. Whoopi shakes her head, smiling. See, art imitates life. Paul continues. But the message of the story is really about listening. The audience quiets slightly, because people spend so much time arguing that they stop hearing each other. One of the hosts nods slowly. That's actually a really good message. Paul shrugs. I think it's something people are craving right now. Whoopi looks thoughtful. Maybe. Another host turns toward the audience. Do you guys agree with that? The audience claps loudly. A few people shout yes. Paul smiles. See. Whoopi laughs softly. All right. The conversation begins to wrap up as the show moves toward the end of the segment. One host says jokingly, You know this interview is going to be all over the internet later today. Paul groans playfully. Oh no. The audience laughs. Another host adds, clips everywhere. Paul shakes his head. I should have just talked about aging backwards. Whoopi laughs loudly. Too late now. As the segment comes to a close, the hosts thank Paul for being on the show. Seriously, one co-host says. This was a really interesting conversation. Paul nods. I had fun. Whoopi smiles. See, we argue, but we're still friends. Paul laughs. I'll take that as a win. The audience applauds as the cameras slowly pull back and the show heads toward commercial break. But the story doesn't end there. Because within minutes of the broadcast airing, clips from the exchange begin circulating online. On X, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok, people start sharing the moment when Paul turned the question back toward the media. Some viewers praise him for staying calm during a tense discussion. Others applaud Whoopi for engaging in the debate instead of shutting it down. Comment sections quickly fill with opinions. Some viewers say the conversation showed exactly why shows like The View remain popular, because real disagreements happen live on television. Others argue about who made the stronger points. A few viral posts highlight the moment the audience gasped when Paul asked if the media talks down to the public. Entertainment websites begin posting headlines about the unexpected exchange. Paul Rudd sparks heated debate on The View. Whoopi Goldberg and Paul Rudd clash over media influence. Clips rack up hundreds of thousands of views within hours. Meanwhile, backstage after the show, the mood is much calmer. Paul reportedly laughs with the hosts and thanks them for the conversation. Several hosts even compliment him for staying thoughtful and respectful during the debate. Whoopi reportedly jokes that he survived the table. By the afternoon, the segment becomes one of the most discussed daytime TV moments of the week. Fans continue debating the conversation online. Some say Paul made an important point about public dialogue. Others say Whoopi asked the tough questions viewers were already thinking. But almost everyone agrees on one thing. It was a real conversation, the kind that rarely happens in scripted interviews. And moments like that are exactly why audiences keep tuning in. So now we want to hear from you. Do you think Paul Rudd handled the conversation well? Or do you agree with Whoopi Goldberg's perspective? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to the Star Talks for more real talk show stories.